And so I don't mean to put you on the spot here, Lynn, but he said, tell her he really liked your article on the 3 types of inflation. Do you know what he's talking about? And if so, can you tell the listeners about what that is?
Sure. Yeah. And I think I covered that in a newsletter and an article. And basically, in the inflation debate, obviously you'll come across different schools of thought of what even inflation is. Some people say it's prices, some people say it's money supply. And my view was, let's not argue over what it is. Let's talk about the different types. Let's just kind of say, okay, there's different types of inflation. And so I covered, okay, there's money supply inflation, which Austrians are fully familiar with. Basically, if the supply of the thing we're using as our unit of account and savings unit is increasing in supply, that's going to have effect on other things as well, like prices. And so that's one type of inflation to measure. Another type of inflation to measure is asset price inflation, which is that when you have a lot of money supply growth, but you're not constrained very much on some of the consumer-driven things. Maybe you're in a period where there's plenty of oil, there's plenty of, maybe there's oversupply, for example. There's, a lot of software innovation happening. So prices are being driven down for a lot of things. Maybe there's globalization happening. So it's not really coming out aggressively in consumer prices. But if you have in that environment where there's a lot of money supply growth, but not a lot of consumer constraints, a lot of that money will end up in assets, basically. Things like houses or stocks or bonds will go up in price significantly. And so people feel richer. And of course, the third type would be consumer price inflation, when things like energy, rent, price of a car, house, when kind of everyday goods start substantially increasing in price. And so what I did in that article and other articles was map out some of those quantitative relationships. Like, what has been the money supply growth since 1870, which is 1870, which is the data set I had to work with. What has been the CPI since that time? What has been the correlation between them? What has been the gap between them? And then kind of going along those lines. And one thing you find that's interesting is that most developed countries, is actually a very tight correlation. The US had a weaker correlation, I think in large part because, starting in that period, we had basically an unsettled continent. So there's like a lot more supply and we had a lot more productivity booms, especially those early years. And so you find different levels of correlation, but there's generally a decent correlation there. And one way that I think of it is that basically inflation is a spectrum. So when you have money supply growing at, say, 7% per year on average, as it does through kind of the developed world, the scarcest goods, things like waterfront property, fine art, the price of a Van Gogh, those things are going to go roughly up in line with the money supply most likely. And that's generally some of the data we see. Whereas things that are a little bit harder to produce, like but are still energy or labor intensive, things like gold, beef, hospital services, things that actually, the median house, things that are still, we've not gotten exponentially better at making, but maybe a little bit better at making. Those will generally grow in price at a rate that is a little bit below the money supply growth, but still higher than CPI. And then when you get down to CPI, you have this long tail of things you've gotten exponentially better at making: software, electronics, offshoring, industrial products, things like that. And so there's a long tail of things that grow at either, some of them shrink and some of them go down in price, like the cost of a gigabyte of storage, for example. Other ones kind of go flat in price, like textiles or grains or things like that. And that kind of brings down the CPI average. So really what people are kind of targeting as the basket of things that they want to buy is usually somewhere in the middle between CPI and money supply growth. That's kind of the level that particular basket grows at.
Oh yeah, very interesting. I've never seen someone look at it the way you just said about the like even in produced goods and services, about the ones that they're, I guess, the elasticity of supply, the ratio or the spectrum of that, and how that could have an impact. What I always thought was interesting too is, like, after QE started, at least in the United States, some folks, in case it's after the financial crisis in 2008, and so the Federal Reserve started doing these massive rounds of quantitative easing that the press was dubbing QE1, QE2, and QE3. And people like me, we were concerned, and some would say we definitely jumped the gun about, like, this is going to cause CPI to go up. And it didn't in the beginning as much as some of us had feared. But it certainly did, the ostensible purpose, was to boost asset prices. So it was funny that it actually, whether you were for the program or against it, everybody agreed that it was going to make some things more expensive. It was just, we have this notion that if stock prices go up, that's good. Whereas if tuna fish prices and gasoline prices go up, that's bad. And yet, if you're somebody who owns a bunch of a pond that's stocked with tuna, you'd want tuna prices to go over. If you own oil deposits, you'd want gasoline to get more expensive. And just like if you own houses or a house, you like a rising real estate market. But if you're 22 and just leaving your parents' house, you want housing to be cheap. So it's just kind of funny how certain things we just take it as a given that's good or bad when there are, just different types of prices that were going up.
Yeah, I agree. And I studied that period a lot. And one of the mistakes that some more recent economists fell into was assuming that because it worked out like that last time, that it'd be the same thing here in the 2020s. They were like, oh, remember, people thought Q was going to be inflationary. Well, it's not inflationary. And a lot of my research in the past several years was saying, no, this one's different because it's actually, there's a transmission mechanism. It's getting out in a broad money supply. So one thing we saw back in that global financial crisis era is that broad money supply didn't go up dramatically. It just kind of kept. If you look at a chart of broad money supply, it actually doesn't look unusual at all for that period. Nothing particularly unusual happened, and so people didn't have more money in their checking and savings accounts. So it was hard to have more money actively chasing more goods. Instead, it was in the banking system. It was kind of like behind the scenes. And one thing I like to point out is that the baseline inflation that we're measuring from is not necessarily zero, and so you can think of that as productivity. So over the long term, things should get cheaper, right? So that the baseline inflation level of prices should generally be slightly negative. But during financial crises like that, the baseline is probably deeply negative. Like I think the way that I kind of describe the QE of that era is that it was anti-deflationary. So if you did not have QE, you probably would have a collapse in broad money supply, basically much like the 1930s, right? So, and people can argue if that's good or bad, but I think that's what would have happened. And so by doing a lot of QE, basically expanding the base money system, they basically kept the broad money supply money good. And so it was inflationary. It's just it was inflationary from a deeply negative level, and it basically just kept the existing money supply in place. And then it wasn't until the 2020s where you had QE combined with big transmission mechanisms, which was more outright price inflationary.
I had done sort of a post-mortem on that stuff after the 2020, because partly what happened is after the coronavirus tide monetary inflation from an Austrian perspective, and then prices started rising rapidly. And as you mentioned in the intro, and we'll get to your book in a second here, Lynn, don't worry, the intro about how Jay Powell early on, and I think in 2020 was, no, we don't expect any problem from this. And then of course, CPI really did get out of hand. And so some people on the right were running victory laps like, oh, who could have guessed that when you massively inject a bunch of dollars into the system, prices go up. Duh. But I was saying, okay, but many of us were talking like that back in 2009 and 10, and it wasn't as apparent, the simple relationship. And that's why guys like Paul Krugman were running victory laps back then, and then guys like Paul Krugman looked foolish in 2021 and 2022 when he kept assuring everybody, oh yeah, this is a one-shot transitory thing, don't listen to these fear mongers, and he kept having to move the goalposts. But I think this is line up with what you're saying, Len. After the fact and look at the two periods, one difference I noticed was in both cases, M1 went way up. And that's partly why I thought back in 2009 and 10 that, no, we should see this, because even though, yeah, they're paid interest on reserves and whatever, some of that money is getting into the hands of the broader public in the sense of just, checking account balances. But M2 did not go up very aggressively in 2009, 2010, whereas it did, after Corona, that stuff. So if you just looked at a chart of M2, you would not have realized the Fed was doing extraordinary stuff right after the financial crisis of 2008. And so I think part of that was because, those money market mutual funds broke the buck and so forth, that people were taking their wealth out of things that show up in the broader aggregates like money market mutual funds and putting them into checking accounts. And the FDIC also got bumped up from 100,000 to 250,000 back when the financial crisis hit. And so it was, by certain more narrow measures of money, it looked like the money supply was exploding. But from broader measures back after the financial crisis, people were just kind of moving stuff around. And so, that kind of would further underscore why eggs didn't triple in price or something back then. I don't know. And also, CPI actually did go slightly negative in November of 2008, just to kind of line up with what you're saying, Lynn, that I think the baseline would have been prices and things like M2 falling had the Fed not started pouring money into the system from the top.
Yeah, that's what we saw back in the Great Depression. Basically, you had banks fail, and when you have a bunch of banks that are highly levered, and it's basically a game of musical chairs. I find that to just be I'm not the first one to use that analogy. I just think it's like the best one, or a juggler, but basically musical chairs. If you have a bunch of kids going around chairs and you add more chairs to it, you're just keeping the game going. And you can imagine different games stopping. If you have 30 kids going around one chair and you stop the music, that's going to be chaos. Whereas if you have 30 kids going around 25 chairs, it's not going to be as chaotic. And so basically what happened in both the Great Depression and 2008 is the music stopped while you were insanely levered, both in terms of broad money to base money, total debt to base money. So every piece of debt is a contractual obligation to pay you money. And there's only so much base money. So it's like it really depends on it going around very quickly. And once that stops, that can collapse very quickly. So debt can default, deposits can default. And FDIC insurance, of course, only has like 1% of deposits actually on hand without money printing. And so I think the baseline would have been significantly deflationary. And the interesting thing is basically these things are always hard to track in real time. Like, for example, when I was analyzing the fiscal situation in 2020, I was talking about upcoming inflation, trying to say that it's different than 2008. So this is actually broad money supply going up very quickly, very likely to be inflationary for CPI, very likely to be having all sorts of stronger impacts. But even then, I could not have told you what years that CPI going to go up. Is it going to take 6 months? Is it going to take 12 months? Is it going to take 24 months? Are we going to measure it at 9%, or is it going to go up to 12%, or is it going to be 5%? Like, it's hard to know how quickly that increase in broad money trickles out. And so it's like directionally high conviction, but these things are always just messy. And of course, that's kind of the nature of economies, is they're highly complex.
Yep. Okay, let me.
Hey, everybody, this is Bob Murphy. Thanks for listening to this clip from the InFi podcast. If you like what you heard and want to hear more, please consider subscribing and share this video with others. We've got new episodes dropping every Friday with more insightful discussions. Stay tuned.